David Miliband, President of the International Rescue Committee, former Foreign Secretary, good friend. Great to be back with you.
Thanks, Ian. Yep, good to be with you.
So really, the topic, while everyone is talking about coronavirus, not many people are talking about the worst refugee crisis to come out of this war in Syria. And of course, talking about Idlib, almost 1 million people have already been displaced. Give us the state of play of the crisis right now.
So it's not just 1 million people have been displaced in the last 3 months. These are people, we're talking 3.5 million people in total.
In the region?
In this region of Syria, the Idlib region of Syria in the northwest of Syria. These are people, half of whom have come from other parts of Syria, and they've been shepherded there by the government when it conquered different parts of the country. So these are people who've been displaced twice, 3 times, 4 times. Even we've met people who've had 10 movements, families with kids being moved on from house to house.
Over the course of the war.
Cousin to cousin, from onwards and onwards. We've got 50,000 people living under trees in temperatures of -10, -11, -12 degrees centigrade. We've got bombing campaigns that have, by the Syrians and the Russians, the Syrian government, their Russian supporters, that have closed over 70 health facilities. You've got now 1 million people being crowded up against the Turkish border in makeshift camps. And this is a situation that, in a time when everyone's sick of the war in Syria, I know that. The Syria fatigue set in a long time ago.
Even in Europe, it's not making anywhere near the headlines that it was when that little child washed up on shore.
Exactly, Aylan Kurdi in 2015. So I get that people are fatigued with the war, not half or a quarter as people who are living in Syria who've more than had enough of it. But these are the largest displacements, the most virulent fighting that the war has seen in the course of the 9 years, nearly 9 years that it's been going. So it's a humanitarian emergency. It's a political emergency because international law is being broken on a daily basis. The bombing of civilians in health centers is a war crime.
Now, we can, and we will talk about what needs to be done and who's responsible for all this. But first, perhaps the why it's not getting attention. One obvious reason is that these people right now are still trapped in Syria up against the Turkish border. They're not getting into Turkey. They're not getting into Europe. Is that
that's
sustainable?
A good point. So you're saying it's because it hasn't become a European crisis, it's therefore not become a political crisis.
That's certainly part of the reason. I'm wondering if that's going to continue to happen in your view. In other words, is that sustainable? Can Turkey continue to keep these 1 million plus people, and again, 3 million in the region, basically balled up in what feels like Gaza right now?
Well, it's interesting that you use the Gaza comparison. Others have as well because of the density of the population. That's the reason they talk about it. Now, we know...
And because they can't get anywhere.
But we know from Gaza that can endure for a very long time. Here you've got more than the population of Gaza. So this can endure. But what President Erdogan of Turkey has said very clearly is that for every new refugee he takes in, remember he's got 3.7 million already, there's another one who's going to go to Europe. I don't think it's just that, though. I think that people don't know what the answer to the Syria crisis is. They don't see any actors whose side they want to be on. We're on the side of the civilians, and I think that that's the side that they should
being the IRC.
The International Rescue Committee. But I think, frankly, anyone with an ounce of humanity should recognize that the civilians of Syria are bearing the brunt of this war, which is a campaign of eradication of opposition that the Assad regime is putting into place. It's at the expense of the population. He doesn't want the refugees to come back, remember. He's made very clear, President Assad, through a range of policies and statements, that he's got a new Syria that he's trying to build on the population who's already there. And so I think those are the reasons why this hasn't become a global issue. There's one other thing that's very important. When the United States isn't present in a discussion, never mind in a military discussion, it's not going to be an issue in the United States. It's striking at the Democratic debate. The candidates were more or less agreed the worst thing would be to have any American troops there. But of course, there are American troops in Syria. They're in the northeast of the country.
They've been pulled back from the border area.
Yeah, but they're in the northeast of the country. And I just want to make this point. It's not a total accident that there's relative stability in the northeast of the country.
Where the Americans happen to be.
Well, I am not a believer that America can be in every part of the world that needs the peace to be kept. But we do know that the ring has been held in the northeast of Syria, in part by the fact it's a Kurdish region, in part by the fact that the Kurds have their own Peshmerga, their own defense force, but also by the fact that there are Americans there now notionally with a mission confined to the protection of the oil fields, but actually nonetheless putting some guardrails on the actions that are taken both by the Syrian government and by their Syrian supporters.
Imagine for a second that I'm President Trump. You're talking to me and you have an opportunity to say what I need to do to respond to this crisis within the realm of what is politically feasible. You would say what?
So I'm running a humanitarian organization. I'm not going to advise him on Pentagon military strategy. What I would say to him is, one, decide that you really care about the fate of these people and the geopolitical impact of more instability in Syria and across the Middle East. Secondly, make it absolutely clear to the Russians, to the Iranians, and to the Syrians that there are consequences, costs for the way the war is being prosecuted in Syria. Third, make absolutely clear that you've got some immediate demands. One, stop the shelling and the missiles. Two, let the humanitarian aid flow, because the UN has a whole list of demands that it needs of more aid to come in. Three, treat the wounded who need help now and whose trauma has to be addressed. Fourth, and finally, stay with this. This is not just, the fate of Syria is not just for Syria, Iran, Syria and Turkey to decide. This needs to be brought back into the international arena where the US and others, alongside the Syrians and the Russians and the Iranians, have a say.
And of course, you haven't mentioned anyone but the Americans in terms of playing a potentially constructive role. Am I to believe that your view, if the United States doesn't do more militarily on the ground and or politically and economically vis-a-vis the Russians, the Syrians, the Iranians, that functionally the Europeans are not going to be in any way relevant?
Well, it's really tough for the Europeans to do it on their own. They're doing some things on their own. They're working with the Turks and, in fact, supporting the Turks in their hosting of refugees. There's significant financial support that's going to Turkey from the European Union.
To keep the refugees in Turkey, essentially.
Effectively, that's the bargain that's been struck. And there are some unprincipled aspects to that, but there are also, remember, there's also a principled aspect. The hosting of refugees is a global public good. And the countries that host refugees, be they Turkey, be they Lebanon, be they Jordan, be they countries in Africa or in Bangladesh, the case of hosting the Myanmar refugees, it's right that they get international support. So it's not the case that Europe can do nothing, but politically and diplomatically, Europe is enormously held back if it's not acting in concert with the US.
So what do you think is likely to happen? How do you think this is likely to play out over the coming 6-12 months?
Well, I'm afraid it's going to get worse before it's going
to get better. What does worse
mean? Worse means more killing, more loss of life incidentally rather than just directly as a result of the war because of the conditions. We've heard about the 7 children who've died in the freezing conditions, more misery for the Syrians, more fear among the refugees who are outside Syria of going home.
So I'm reluctant to even ask this, but we know that in some of the world's worst conflict areas, like in Yemen, it's not just about the war. On top of that, they also ended up with one of the worst health conditions, with cholera, of anywhere. We're now all, of course, very deeply concerned about coronavirus. And Iran, for example, has one of the biggest outbreaks, and their ability to control their borders is minimal. So clearly, it seems like this is likely to get into the refugee crisis in Syria. How do you even begin to think about the implications, how to manage it? What do you do?
Well, look, I think that the way to think about it is as follows. Coronavirus has no respect for borders, obviously, but it is attracted by the vulnerable. And some of the most vulnerable are people who are on the run as a result of war. Now, notwithstanding the Iranian case, up till now, the Middle East has been, relatively speaking, free of the coronavirus. But you're absolutely right to say that in populations on the move, the capacity for hygiene, for effective public health is massively compromised. We're obviously worried both about the entry of the disease, the spread of the disease, and then finally, we know that the death rate globally is kept down to 2% amongst those who have got it because there are health interventions. the populations who don't have health interventions, who don't have the kind of machinery that's needed to support them, those are the people that we're serving. And so really trying to think through not just the prevention side, but also the treatment side is a massive challenge now, because although you're right, it hasn't yet hit displaced populations, it must be a matter of time, given that the global estimates are 40 to 70% of the population hit. And
so if you're talking to people directly who say, like, we have no idea what we can do, and they care, what would you tell them?
I'd say go to the International Rescue Committee website, rescue.org, and learn about the conditions on the ground. I'd say we've launched an appeal with all the other leading NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, the Global Emergency Response Coalition, to raise funds. I'd also say America has a proud tradition of welcoming refugees to the United States, but it's basically stopped for Syrians over the last 3 years. Over the course of this fiscal year, I think the figure is less than 400 Syrians have been allowed into the country, even though there are 6 million Syrian refugees around the world. But those Syrians who are here need the support of Americans to help them integrate into American life. And the leaders of the country, in the Senate, in Congress, in the White House, need to know that Americans want to continue to be a haven for people in need, because my goodness, the people who fled Syria are in need.
David Miliband, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.